Good afternoon and welcome to today's edition of Scala's Love of Learning Live. I am pleased to be here with you today and pleased to welcome our guest, Professor Elizabeth Corey of Baylor University. Before I say a little bit more about our guest for today, I want to just say briefly a couple of words about the format and about this series, Scala's Love of Learning webinars. So we have people joining us today from all across the country and even outside of the United States. I would love to see who's here. If you want to introduce yourself, feel free to go to the chat button. You can tell us your name, you can tell us where you're logging in from, and if you want, say something about what you do. Are you a teacher? Are you a parent? What drew you here today? It's always great to know who's with us and what brought you here. So you can put that in the chat button. As regards the format, I will have a dialogue with Professor Corey for about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. You can submit your questions using the Q&A button. So please go ahead at any point during the dialogue, you can put a question in there. If something sparks you, is interesting, you want to follow up, go ahead and put your question. I'll remind people towards the end when we're going to open up to the Q&A and start answering questions from the audience. Now, I know some of you are new, so let me tell you a little bit about Scala and about the Love of Learning webinars. Well, I started Scala because I wanted people to become like their favorite teachers, people who know how to integrate the knowledge that they have of a subject with a passion for learning. I started Scala in 2016 because I wanted to spread the knowledge about a liberal arts education, both the philosophy behind what is a liberal arts education, but also show concretely what does a liberal arts education look like in practice in a variety of settings. Scala has become a movement of educators and students who are committed to transformational, holistic forms of education. Scala has sponsored reading groups here in Princeton Theological Seminary, where I teach on the faculty in practical theology, and our alumni at different campuses, including Baylor, where Professor Corey is visiting us from today, have also started reading groups as a follow-up to participating in Scala's summer program called Rediscovering Integral Humanism, where I have taken students for the past 3 summers to different Benedictine monasteries and studied the mission of a university and the purpose of education. This summer, I won't be doing that seminar in the summer in person, but I am delighted to be teaching an online course through the Pepperdine School of Public Policy on humanizing educational philosophy and practice. The Pepperdine School of Public Policy is one of the co-sponsors of today's webinar, and I'm extremely grateful to Pete Peterson, the Dean of Pepperdine School of Public Policy and the Director of the American Project at Pepperdine. Please, if you haven't already checked them out, do look up the American Project and the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. They're doing wonderful work, and I'm extremely grateful for their co-sponsorship today. I'm also grateful to the Baylor Institute for the Studies of Religion for their co-sponsorship. I have been a fellow at Baylor's ISR, and I'm delighted to have them here co-sponsoring this event. So what we're doing in these webinars is trying to bring live to an audience across the country and really across the world some of the key themes that cut through all of Scala's events. What is the purpose of education? How do you integrate love and reason? And how do eternal ideas about education play out in today's context where education has become highly politicized? So we're going to, given the COVID crisis that struck and people leaving campuses, I decided to take Scala's conferences and ideas and conversations we were having in person in Princeton and other locations and bring them online, bring them to you. So this will be recorded, and this dialogue will be placed on Scala's YouTube channel. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Scala's YouTube channel to see this interview, past interviews, and highlights from them. So now, without further ado, let me welcome our guest, Professor Elizabeth Corey. Elizabeth Corey is a professor in the Honors College at Baylor University. She has her PhD in political science or political theory, if I'm correct. And I've invited her today to talk about this topic, learning in love. And so before we get started, before we get started talking about some of her articles, I wanted to ask Professor Corey a little bit about her own biography. I like to start these webinars off, because they're about education, learning about our speakers' own education. So would you tell us about your own educational background, where you studied, and what were some big turning points for you in your education?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me, Margarita. It's a pleasure to be here. In terms of education, I began as a very devoted piano major at Oberlin Conservatory back in the early 90s, because I was very certain as a young person that the only worthwhile thing to do with one's life is to become a professional musician. So I went off to the conservatory and was certain that that would be my path, and got about 2 years in and realized this was probably not the career or life for me, not because I didn't love it, but because it had become so professionalized. So luckily, Oberlin, as you may know, Oberlin has a reputation for lots of things, campus activism being one, but also wonderful liberal arts. At least it certainly has in the past had the reputation for a very serious liberal arts school. So I was able there to switch my major from music to classics, because I thought, well, if I'm not going to do music, I might as well start at the beginning, certainly at the beginning of Western culture, and learn Latin and learn classical civilization. So I ended up doing a full classics degree, but in my last semester at Oberlin, took an art history class and discovered I'd been missing out all these years on my true love, which was art history. So after leaving Oberlin, I went on to do a master's in medieval art history. Loved that, wrote on early Christian art and medieval art. And then my last semester there, on a whim, took a political science seminar and ended up in the master's and PhD program in political science at Louisiana State University, which was not at all, none of this was planned at all. It was, to use Michael Oakeshott's famous phrase, the pursuit of intimations, finding things that you are interested in and drawn to, and following where those lead. So I ended up in political science at the end of it all, did American politics, but more political theory. And at the end of that, I moved to Baylor with my husband, who's also a professor here, and have been here ever since. I've been here 18 years now at Baylor. And when I arrived, the Honors College was just getting started under the deanship of Tom Hibbs, who's now gone on to be president of University of Dallas. But we're still here, and the college is still doing well. So anyway, that's a very, very kind of quick biography of me in terms of intellectual biography.
That's so fascinating. Now, if I'm correct, when I looked up your biography, you're originally from Louisiana, is that right?
Yes, I'm from Baton Rouge, and still have family there, and love South Louisiana, all the culture, all the food, and go back as often as I can. And was actually very prejudiced against Texas for many, many years, and said to my husband, no matter where we end up, it can't be Texas. And of course, this happens to everybody. It was Texas, and it was Waco, and we've loved it. So yeah, I'm a Southerner through and through.
That's funny, because that's not where I was going. Where I was going was I was trying to imagine what it's like to go from Louisiana to Oberlin, which, as you said, is known for a lot of things. It's known for its wonderful liberal arts education, and it's known for its activism. I wouldn't say it's known for being a heavily Southern place, whether that be welcoming people from Louisiana or Texas. So to imagine you going there and starting off with music, then switching to classics while you're also seeing a lot of political activism around you. You also spent some time in Germany studying German philosophy, isn't that right, at Heidelberg?
Yes, that was later. But your question is really interesting about how does a Southerner from Louisiana end up at one of the most radical places in the country in terms of higher ed, and what was it like? And it was truly an experience both good and bad. And I've written about this in a piece having to do with Oberlin's big flap last summer, having to do with the bakery. I won't go into that right now. But there really are these two distinct sides of Oberlin that are markedly different. One is the very serious musician and liberal art sort of path. The other is the activist path. And my fear is that Oberlin has gone so far down the activist path that some of these other parts of it that have been so important throughout are being eclipsed. Now, don't get me wrong, Oberlin has had a history of this. It was a stop on the Underground Railroad way back, and there's a very admirable tradition of activism. But my fear for Oberlin in the present day is that it's gone so activist that some of the other serious liberal arts and music is being overshadowed.
Well, I do want to come back to this question of whether or not the political activism we've seen in universities in the past 5 years, in the past 5 weeks or days, is a good thing or a bad thing. But before we get to that, because you've written quite extensively on activism on campuses, I want to actually back up and talk a little bit about the first article of yours that I read, and it's the same name as this webinar, Learning in Love. To be honest, I'm not sure how I read it. If I had to guess, one of my students sent it to me, but it has been a cornerstone of the Scala summer program. And I wanted to ask you to tell our audience a little bit about that piece. First of all, why you wrote it, and also what is your central argument there? Because when people think about learning or liberal learning, they're not usually thinking about love. So why did you write this piece, and what do you hope that people learn by reading it?
Okay, that's a great question. I wrote the piece back in 2014, and it was an immediate reaction to a report that had been written by, and I can't even remember what the name of the group was. It's called The Heart of the Matter. And it was a manifesto about the importance of learning the humanities. But when I went to read the manifesto, it was full of platitudes and sort of empty words talking about the importance of liberal education in a way that made me think, if this were supposed to encourage people to go toward the liberal arts, it would do the exact opposite. I would rather not be involved in this at all. So I started thinking as a result of that, I said, well, okay, this is what people are saying about liberal arts education. Why did I start this? What got me into this? And how did I get to be an advocate of liberal learning? And as I reflected on it, I realized, well, it was a number of people. It was one person in particular, but it was a number of people who modeled for me a kind of life that I said, if I'm not going to be a musician, maybe there's something here in this world of learning that I've missed and that is worth pursuing. So the piece makes the argument that really this is how people grow to love the liberal arts. Not by being told that it's good for you or that everybody, should have a liberal arts education because that's what civilized people do. All these defenses you hear, but rather it was often being evangelized. I use that word in the piece, and it is to be evangelized, to be shown, to be led, to be brought to an understanding of why reading these books and thinking and talking in these ways is important in itself. And I really, to this day, think that is best modeled through person-to-person conversation, modeling in the classroom, in the seminar room, in the living room. I mean, so many professors, you all listening to this probably have experience of this, probably invited you to their homes and said, have tea with me or come have a meal. And then suddenly, the life of learning isn't just this thing you do at college only, but it's something that you do in every aspect of your life. So that's what originated the piece. And I also say in the piece that it's deeply personal. And so that the teacher who appeals to me may not be the teacher who appeals to somebody else. And that's the genius of a university, that you can have a diversity of people all teaching their own subjects, hopefully talking with each other. But appealing to the different loves of the students and having different loves of their own and modeling that for the students.
Mhm.
And that's the sum of the piece.
You know, I remember reading it and being struck, and my students who have read it in my summer program have been struck by this. You ask people to ask themselves, like, who taught
Yeah.
you to fall in love with the subject? Not what did you learn in school from K to 12? What did you learn in high school science? Who taught you to love what you love today, right? And what you're doing there, I think, is kind of making this point you just made, that the best educators are people who love their subject and come into the classroom eager to communicate the love of knowledge for their particular area. And that inspiration is truly something that students don't forget. But as you say, different teachers and different subjects appeal to different people. Now,
Mhm.
this is a very different kind of argument than the type of argument you hear in some forms of advocacy for the humanities or for the great books. And I think you were critiquing in your article that, well, the humanities, it might actually give you good critical thinking skills and good writing skills, right? But you just don't want to lose sight of the fact that that kind of practical end isn't the full end of a liberal education. Is that right?
That is right. I mean, I asked this question of who, I mean, and this is actually interesting, and I would encourage anybody who's listening to this to do the same thing. Who was it? Who was the person who introduced you to, if you love the liberal arts, and I'm guessing nobody who's listening to this doesn't, who was the person that introduced you to that? And very often it will be one person, sometimes more than one. Sometimes there are key people throughout your life who do this. For me, it was a professor at Louisiana State University who was not actually my professor, but was a family friend. And he would sit and talk with me for hours about vocation, about the relative merits of different kinds of lives. We would read together. We'd read Plato. We would read Michael Oakeshott, who I ended up writing a dissertation about. We would read Vogelin, Eric Vogelin, the prominent political philosopher. We would do all of this reading and talking and more reading and talking, and it was magical. And that's something I try now to reproduce with my own students. But it takes a kind of humility and charity. Because look, what's the reward for a teacher who does this kind of intensive work with a single student or a group of students? There isn't any. There's no reward for in publication. The university doesn't really recognize this kind of work, but the people who have been most influential in my life are the people who do this kind of thing. And it arises not from some kind of professionalism or an attempt to have another line on the Vita, but out of love for students and love for other people.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because when I thought about this question, like who made you fall in love with the topic or who made you fall in love with learning, you know, what honestly what comes to my mind, and I'm really lucky to be able to say this, it's my mother and father. You know, my father had an advanced degree in math, and his way of bonding with me as a 5-year-old was to teach me algebra, because my dad thought math was fun. So my dad not only taught me math, he taught me to think that going into math class was fun. My mother, she's born and raised in Cuba. All of her education was in Cuba. She didn't have any education in the United States until she came to the United States in her 20s. But she taught me to love the fact that I had access to education, and she read books in English with me, teaching herself as she read with me. So I had this love of learning because parents are, of course, primary educators. Now, some people get that kind of attention from a teacher or from a professor, but I'm not quite sure I always did when I got off to college, which then leads me to my second question, maybe turning around the question. My previous question was, who made you fall in love with learning? Maybe a second question we need to ask students to honestly ask themselves is, why did you fall out of love with learning? And that leads me, I think, to another piece that you've written that I really want to encourage people to read, and it's called Achievement and the Christian Life, which you wrote for the American Enterprise Institute initiative on faith and public life. Because part of the reason I think your piece on learning and love is so crucial is because I think everybody who's listening here today and everybody who goes on to college has fallen in love with learning at some point. But a lot of them have fallen out of love with learning. And learning has become a tool for achievement. And I want us now to talk a little bit about your piece on achievement in the Christian life, because I think you take a nuanced approach that, of course, we should care about achievement. But what's the risk when learning becomes nothing but, as you say, kind of a way to soft brag about what your grades were or what kind of fellowship you got, or, what we called in my PhD program, shameless self-promotion.
Yeah.
What happens when the end of learning becomes achievement and love disappears? So why did you write this piece? And what do we need to do to rethink this achievement culture we've created?
Well, those are great questions. I wrote the achievement piece because, again, I mean, it was kind of a personal observation. I teach in the Honors College, and as you can guess, the Honors College brings in the most highly talented students at Baylor. They're high achievers coming in. They have to have, in most cases, minimum test scores to get in, although that may change rather soon. But the point is, they're high achievers when they come in. And what I would see is that my students would get, a semester or so in, and then they'd start feeling really stressed. They would sometimes come to me and say, I don't know if I can do all this. I'm exhausted. I know that I need to do the internship, during the summer, and I need to be involved in this society and this other event, group of events on campus. But it's all making me tired, and I kind of question what it's all for. So the more I talk to the students, and this continues, of course, any of you who are teachers will recognize this very well, as they get older, the pressure gets even more intense. What will they be doing after college? They're constantly being encouraged to facilitate their future career prospects by doing X and Y, and there is no time for leisure. And there's no real time for contemplation during this sort of rat race that is set up in the very beginning of college. So the piece I wrote on achievement arose out of many conversations with high achieving young people who started to say, what am I doing all this work for? What is the end goal of all this? And I wanted to offer, and I do offer in the piece, some alternative ways of thinking about achievement, because I mean, I know David Brooks has written about this, his distinction between the resume and the eulogy values. And that's a very nice way of putting it, that, what are people going to say about you at your funeral? Do you want them to say that you wrote 17 books, or that you were a wonderful person and a devoted mother, or any number of other sort of personal goals that you might try to achieve? Obviously, I try to make the case in the piece that there is a place for both of these things, but we need to reorient the way we think about achievement so that it doesn't become the single and only goal of life. Instead, I think we need to imagine that there are other goods that are personal, that consist in love, that are as or probably far more important than the things we do to put on our resume and to become successful in the world. So that's an overview of what the piece was about. And it arose out of personal experience. All my writing, except some academic writing doesn't, but all my more popular writing arises out of personal experiences. And I think that's what makes it more readable than some of the academic work.
Well, you're also a beautiful writer, may I add. So anyone who hasn't read her work, please look in the chat box. We're putting some of the links, go to her website and read it. But I will say I was so happy to read the achievement piece because I've long joked that I wanted to start an Overachievers Anonymous club. And I think, having gone to Yale undergraduate, the expectations are really high that you'll get out of Yale and do something great. And when I, lived in Latin America for 3 years and worked in a foundation that worked on the peace and development process in Latin America, came to Princeton for graduate school, I was shocked that I got in, but I did. And then once again, I felt like I was on the rat race. And you mentioned something to this effect in one of your pieces, that times of crisis in our personal lives can make us rethink achievement. And I'd say for me, that moment was probably my father's unexpected passing during graduate school. And it turns out my father's funeral sadly ended up being the day before 9/11. And he was a lifelong New Yorker and very proud New Yorker. So that was a real moment of huge crisis for me, where I did ask myself, why am I even bothering to do this PhD? Why does the life of the mind matter when there's this huge world crisis going on right now? And I really struggled with that. And fortunately, what I did, and I recommend this to my listeners, and this is part of how Scala eventually came to be, I started organizing just small reading groups with my fellow grad students from my department or from one of the Christian ministries on campus. And one of the books that I read that helped me rethink my own approach to life and to learning, and I believe this has been a source of inspiration for you too, somebody recommended I read Joseph Pieper, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. So what are some of the resources that you have learned from that have helped you rethink this kind of overachievement culture?
Yeah, many. There are many, and Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture is one of the best. And I really would, for those of you who don't know it, read it. It's a wonderful short little book, but there's a lot in it. In that book, Pieper makes the argument that we've forgotten how to be leisurely. And he sets out various definitions of leisure that are not the real understanding of leisure. I mean, he's not talking about leisure as in, I'm going to spend my leisure time sitting on my back porch with a drink in my hand. I mean, leisure is not just mere rest. It's not rest so that you can do more work in the future. It is actually a categorically different kind of activity from work, which requires a sort of contemplative attitude that has to be cultivated. You have to kind of learn what it is and learn why it's attractive and then learn how to do it. But he contrasts that with where he thinks we are now, and he was writing something 60, 70 years ago. We're all the more there now. He calls it a world of total work, so that all of our striving is oriented toward work, toward achievement, toward money making, but not just that. I mean, as many of you I think would probably agree, so much of what we strive after now is honor, not money. We want to be published in the best places. We want to be at the best schools. We want to be at the best companies. We want to be constantly more and more excellent. And Pieper finds that to be a rather dreadful way of living if all our striving is aimed at honor and ultimately at work. So he makes a distinction between the person as a functionary versus a person as a full human being who can observe the Sabbath and can observe celebrations and can understand what leisure is. And he's talking about how hard it is to cultivate that attitude in the present day. So that's a wonderful book for all of you who probably don't have a lot of leisure, but maybe want to cultivate it a little bit more. My other very important influence in thinking about achievement was or is Michael Oakeshott, who was a political philosopher, British political philosopher lived from 1901 to about 1990. And he, throughout his work, was concerned to show the limits of achievement in human life. There's a wonderful essay that you can look up. It's in a book called Religion and the Moral Life. It's by Oakeshott. It's essays that were found after his death in his desk drawer that he had not published. And one of these little essays is called Work and Play. And actually, it's been republished in First Things. So go to the First Things website and type in Work and Play, and you'll find that essay there. And he makes a very Pieperian distinction between work as something we do to satisfy wants, first to satisfy needs, but then to satisfy wants. And it never ends because we're constantly looking for the next thing. And after that, we get that next thing, we're looking for the next thing. And he says play is different. So he's contrasting play with the endless satisfaction of wants. And he says, what is play? Well, it consists in love, friendship, conversation, liberal learning, artistic, aesthetic experience, all these things that the liberal arts try to promote. And those are the modes of, that's the mode of play. And I was very, very captured by that. And some of this is personal. I mean, to come back to Margarita's first question, you know, for anybody who's grown up in the world of classical music, it's all about achievement. I mean, hopefully you still love the playing of music, but a lot of times you don't because you're just trying to get to the next level. And so I came out of a very achievement-focused mindset, and that was a problem. Mm-hmm. Because when I left it, I realized, well, there are other things to do with one's life than just to achieve and to achieve and to achieve. So both Oakeshott and Pieper were incredibly important in helping me realize, yeah, life is not all about achievement.
Well, I mean, it's great to hear you remark on what's affected you, that these readings have affected you personally. I mean, I will say that when I maybe began to realize I was an overachiever was during my PhD, and I started a reading group. And maybe that's why I've been doing all these reading groups for all these years. It's because I need help. I found that I needed a support group in a certain sense to read these ideas and study them. And I remember becoming, a tenure track professor at the University of North Carolina, and I started a women's reading group through some of the women in the local churches called Inspiring Women, where we read some of this. And what I began to realize was that a lot of literature that might be questioning the achievement culture focuses on work-life balance, right? How much time are you giving to each role in your life? And there's something to be said for that. But I think what Pieper and also what Oakeshott are saying is that it's not just about how many hours go to work and how many hours go to non-work, but what's the state of mind that you're bringing both into your work and into your rest. And what I found, and you talk about this in your article, is that we get habituated to a certain way of being in the world. And for me, even when I would block off the time to do non-work things, it was incredibly difficult to slow down my mind because I was in overdrive most of the time. So what I think Pieper and Oakeshott are actually doing is kind of challenging us more, not just to change our exterior, but to change ourselves from the inside out, which is an extremely difficult thing to do. And for me, I've done that through my faith, also through more intentionally cultivating time alone in nature or time in art museums. And coming to see this is actually part of my education because it's part of forming me as a person. Now, do you find that you get to apply these ideas to your work as a professor in the Honors College at Baylor? I mean, is it actually possible to live in this leisurely way while being an honors student at Baylor and an Honors College professor at Baylor?
That's a great question. I was just telling somebody the other day, I was asked what was my favorite book, and I said, well, probably one of my favorites would be Leisure, the Basis of Culture. But then I remarked to him how ironic it was that I found myself rereading Leisure, the Basis of Culture in a huge hurry right before I was going to teach it in a class. And the discontinuity there struck me because what Pieper is calling for is a kind of reorientation of the soul, and it is very hard to do in the modern world. And it's harder the older you get and the more responsibilities you have. I've taken over the direction of, I'm the director of the honors program at Baylor. Well, what that means is in addition to teaching and all the things I normally do as a professor, I'm also worrying about where people's office is going to be located and what does the budget look like and what meeting do I have with the next group of people. So there's all this stuff that sort of encroaches on the possibility of leisure. And it is, I'm not telling anybody in this audience anything they don't know. It's very, very hard to carve out the space for a different way of being in the world because the world pushes us toward constant activity. I mean, and technology, we don't even need to say what that does. We're constantly attentive to emails and to text messages and all the demands of all the people we know in our lives. It's so hard to make that distinction. I do, however, think that recognizing that the distinction is there to be made and observed is in itself a good. So that if Oakeshott and Pieper can remind us, yes, life is not all this terribly unending rat race, and there are other ways of orienting, then you can try to cultivate those other ways of being. And that's what I try to show my students. So, a lot of them will read Pieper and they're like, oh, I don't really get what he's up to. But then we talk about it and they say, oh, yes, I do have experiences of something like that. So, for example, I always ask them, is there anything that you do for its own sake and not for another end? And it takes them a while. And they're like, well, maybe study. Well, and it comes down to the fact that they can study either for another end or study as an end in itself. So I end up asking them, is there a class you've ever taken that you've loved but known that it wasn't going to affect your future prospect for a career? And they almost always say yes. There was that class in literature. Or if they're a humanities person, they'll say, yeah, there was that math class that I usually don't like math, but I just loved it for its own sake. And I say, okay, that's getting to the kind of leisure that the Pieper and Oakeshott are talking about, doing something for its own sake and not with thought for what's going to follow it. Listening to music is usually that. I mean, you can listen to music for a music appreciation class because you have to have a grade, but that's not the way people mostly listen to music. So there are these activities, friendship, certain kinds of friendship, where the end is not using the friend for any purpose, but delighting in the friend. So there, we do have experience of these leisured modes of activity. It's just that almost all of us get in this compulsive list making mode, and it's very hard to get out of it.
Well, and I would say that to live this, it is challenging in the modern world, but there's a definite payoff. One of which you just said, which is friendship. And I think that's tied to a deeper point that Pieper's making. And I think also Oakeshott, though I'm less familiar with Oakeshott. But I think they're both making this point that the achievement culture is actually very self-centered in a way. And what you call for when you talk about love as an alternative to the achievement culture, something about love and the way you understand it is actually about self-transcendent. It's about stop kind of always focusing on yourself and how much you can calculate and how much you can do. And I think that kind of self-transcendence is key to developing authentic friendships, friendships that aren't about utility, friendships that are about actual deep connection. And as you say in many of your pieces, seeing the other person as they are and as how they want to be seen, not seeing them as a step in our own. And students have told me this, that the way that social media works or makes them think, other people become something they can use to further their own achievement. And I think the kind of model of education you're advocating and I'm advocating is directly trying to respond to that, where students feel that their friendships have become subjugated to this achievement culture. Is that something you've also heard students talk about?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's easy to do. I mean, one of the things that you hear, certainly in certain parts of the university, it's about networking. So students will say, yeah, I mean, part of the reason I came to Baylor or whatever school they're attending is so that I could network, and find the people who would put me in the position that I'll occupy after college. And that is, of course, a very obviously utilitarian understanding of friendship. Obviously, most of them also have really wonderful friendships that are not utilitarian, but there is this sort of encouragement to view everyone as a potential help or hindrance in your long-term plans. And I guess that's, I mean, in that sense, both Oakeshott and Pieper are saying, yeah, I mean, there's another way of living, and it's not that. I might as well just also say a couple of things about the achievement piece. I mean, what I'm trying to do in there is not only to show, especially younger people, the futility of a life based on achievement, but to say, look, there are good ways of understanding achievement too. I mean, the piece does not say you ought to do nothing with your life and achievement is worthless and it's a waste of time. It doesn't say that, but it says, there are ways of thinking about it and that are better for your soul, frankly. One of them is to think about your desire to achieve as being inspired by a vision of the good. So that if, let's say, you want to be a professional musician, well, why do you want to do that? Well, you could say, because I want to be famous, or you could say, because I want to achieve the excellence and beauty that, say, Alfred Brendel, wonderful pianist, achieves in his Haydn sonatas. That's what I want to do. I want to do something on that order. I recognize that there is a beauty, there is a goodness in that activity, and I want to do it too. So that to me is a very healthy way of thinking about achievement. The other is one other way of thinking about achievement is also to say, well, it's not just about what I do through hard work and perseverance. It's also a kind of discernment of my own gifts. Let's say, whoever you are, you're born with gifts. The discernment of those gifts is very important, first of all, but it's also a way of saying whatever achievement I achieve, whatever I do it with my life, it's not wholly mine. It's actually given to me by God, so that I have certain gifts that I can choose, if I can discern them, then to make actual. So those are two much more positive ways, I think, of thinking about achievement. And then ultimately, I make the argument that in the highest things, you end up not thinking about yourself. So that once you become excellent at something, whether that's teaching or writing or being a tax attorney or being a doctor, you're actually looking for the good of other people and not yourself. So that you're activity isn't about you and how great you are, but it's rather about how can I make the lives of others better and encourage them in their pursuits. So I think there are lots of positive ways of thinking about achievement, but it's just that we get caught up in the competitive nature of it, and it's very easy to have that happen.
Right, so it's not that achievement or utility in and of themselves are bad, but if they're the highest end all the time, then we've gone a little too far. I also have students read a great book. I've led several reading groups in a book called Genuine Friendship by Philip Halfacre, and students get a lot out of that. I think C.S. Lewis is another great go-to to learn about friendship. His book, The Four Loves, was one that I also read in a reading group, a real classic. And of course, his essay that you and I have both written on, Learning in Wartime, addresses this very key point that from a faith perspective, kind of the good that we do through our academic life is really secondary. The primary thing we're doing is trying to conform our minds to the good that God wants to come, and all of the effort. And certainly, believe me, I always tell people, if you want to do a PhD, get prepared to feel totally useless, because most of what you do ends up in the trash bin. I mean, I wrote about this in my article, Pruning the Mind in Life of a Crisis, in the Hedgehog review. It's extremely humbling to try to write an original piece of scholarship, because most of what you write is trash, literally in the trash bin. But somehow, magically, eventually something comes through. And so that's when you realize that the best we can do with our minds is strive and try to achieve, but also be open to that mystery and to that grace. And as I think Lewis really pushes us to think, to not identify the core of who we are with what we achieve. That's the point you're trying to make. It's about, in your core identity, is it your CV? And I think for most people it's not, but it's easy to slip into this habit. And that habit then affects the way we approach learning, it affects the way we are in the classroom, it affects friendships. So let's now talk a little bit about what is actually happening on most university campuses today with regards to the end of education and to friendships. You have just finished a week-long course teaching for the American Enterprise Institute on, I believe it was called Defending Disinterest. You wrote a wonderful piece, again, for National Affairs, published by the American Enterprise Institute, on defending disinterest in the university. It's similar to a piece you published in the Chronicle of Higher Education with a wonderfully provocative title, The University Has No Purpose. Read that article to find out what she means by that, or just keep listening. But since you're fresh off of this seminar that you taught just last week, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more. You talk a little bit about these two modes of the university. One you call the political practical, and the other you call, I believe you call it the disinterested. Mm-hmm. So what are these two modes, and how is it that you propose that they can actually both coexist peacefully on the same campus?
Yes, that's a great question. I have to confess, and if anybody is interested, do read the Defending Disinterest piece in National Affairs. This comes out of a notion of what's called modality, and it was a big idea of Michael Oakeshott's, and I'm taking from Michael Oakeshott there. And I think I can explain it best by using an example. Imagine a water bottle. I don't have one to hold up and show you right now, but we've all seen a million water bottles. If I were to hold a water bottle in my hand and say, "What is this?" What's the first answer you would give? Well, I can almost be certain that it would be something like, "This is a conveyance to get water to my mouth. I want a drink, and this holds water, and so I'm going to use it for that reason." Okay, absolutely fine. But I could ask the same question again and ask for you to answer in a different mode. All right. Well, what would that look like? What would a different mode be? I mean, the practical mode is the one I've just given, which has to do with desires and aversions and things that attract us and things we want to avoid. It's the moral practical mode. But there's a way of thinking about the water bottle that is not that, and it is, well, it's a thing made of polymers. It has molecules and atoms. I'm not conversant in science very well, but you could say there's a scientific way of looking at this that is categorically different from the answer that was first given, which was that it's a way of drinking water. You could go and give a historical answer. You could say this is the modern version of the Thracian drinking horn. Well, that's a historic answer. And then finally, you could say, well, it's none of those things. It's actually an object of beauty whose curvy lines are attractive to the eye, and translucence, grabs us, and it's an object of beauty, and I could sit and contemplate it. So what I'm doing in those 4 examples is giving you a kind of modal understanding of the world, where by far the dominant one is the practical mode, but you've got aesthetic, you've got historical, you've got scientific, and maybe many more. The reason I bring this up is that I make the argument in the piece Margarita referenced that there are ways of looking at university education in different modes. Then we are all extremely familiar with 2 iterations of the practical mode. The one is the university as a means to a flourishing life, a flourishing economic life. So this is what you hear all the time. I want to go to the university because I want to get my degree in pre-med degree, and then go on and become a doctor and make a lot of money. A lot of kids are really straightforward about saying this at Baylor. Other people will, have other career aspirations. That's one way of seeing the university as a practical way of getting to your next goal. The other practical way of understanding the university is, of course, very common in this present day. It's the university as a vehicle for advocating for certain political and social causes, and what I think Jonathan Haidt has called social justice university. That's also very prominent. So that your time at the university is understood as a means to something else that you will go on and do later. Against all that, against the practical and moral understanding of what a university is for, I make an argument in this piece that is, we ought to understand the university time as, I call it disinterested, but I basically mean let's use our time at the university to understand what is out there to be understood. Let's read great books. Let's learn math. Let's explore science. Let's do all the things that a university affords for us without thinking about how am I going to use this in the future. Let's enjoy, you can see how this all goes with Pieper and Oakeshott. Let's enjoy what we're doing for its own sake and for what it offers to us now, and for the self-reflection that it can offer. But it is what I'm calling disinterested, because we're not using it with an interested aim of something that we will do in the future. So the piece ends with the question: Can these 2 different understandings of a university coexist? And some people say no. Some people say you've got to do either one or the other. But I'm hoping that at many universities there is a place for both. The problem I find, though, is that universities increasingly don't understand the disinterested kind of learning. They want everything to be relevant to the present day and to the economic concerns of the surrounding area, or to the pursuit of science. They're always looking for ways to relate what's going on at the university to these practical goals, and I think that's kind of a corruption of what we're really doing at the university. So that was a very long answer.
No, that was great. I would just say that in the time since I've been thinking really deeply about these issues, it also seems to me that the activist model of education is spreading to K-12. And so I think that these debates are extremely relevant. And so I got the sense in reading your piece that the activist model might have something good about it as something redeemable, but that it has certain pitfalls that people often can't quite put their finger on. And so I wondered if you could help us just kind of spell out. You mentioned earlier at the beginning of our talk that Oberlin maybe has gone too far. But you're also saying these 2 models can coexist. So what are the pitfalls of the activist model, and when do we know that it's gone too far?
Yeah, I'm skeptical about activism, and I have to be fair and say I'm skeptical about activism both from the left and from the right, because either one is essentially making the end of university education something other than the education itself. It is saying, look, at Oberlin, it looks like this. We are going to embrace the left-leaning political causes. Our classes are going to revolve around that, not all of them, but many. And we are going to equip you to go out and make a difference in the world and change the world in ways that we've preordained to be correct. Now, you don't see this as much coming from the political right, but there was an episode on my campus last year where it was a Young Americans for Freedom group, and they wanted to bring in Matt Walsh, and they did end up bringing in Matt Walsh. But the point was they saw this not as a chance to bring in a really interesting speaker, but to provoke some of the campus left-leaning groups. And so both those to me seem like corruptions of what really ought to be going on at a university, which is, yeah, we hear a lot of different perspectives, but the aim is not to go out and change the world as a result of this, but rather to understand better the conditions that are making our world such that it is in the way it is now. I do think that, I don't want to get into too controversial a subject right now, but I think some of this is going on at the very moment with the Black Lives Matter movement. And there's a sense that to oppose that or to question that movement in any way is equivalent to being a really bad person. And I think that we need to be able to discuss these things openly.
Mm-hmm. Well, you say in that piece that we need less of what you call rage readings and less of a education that teaches people to critique and tear down. What did you mean by less rage reading?
Yeah, well, how often do we? I heard another term similar to that recently, but how often do we read things that we disagree with simply to say how wrong they are? I mean, I actually try not to do that very much because it's not good for my soul. But it's very often the case, especially, and I'm not on Twitter, but I did get an account on Twitter, and I started to see how Twitter works. And it turns out, I mean, a lot of what goes on there is people being angry at other people for saying things they don't like, and there's not a lot of productive comment that emerges out of that. I mean, that is a kind of rage read. Oh, so and so said something so outrageous. Can you believe he wrote this in this place? And then somebody else piles on and piles on. I mean, that kind of thing to me is really a waste of intellectual energy. Not that you shouldn't disagree vehemently with others, and you're certainly free to do that. But I don't want people to read my work simply to hate it. Although that's happened, by the way.
Well, I struggle with this sometimes, for example, when I'm teaching authors who I know I ultimately don't agree with, one of whom I know you also teach because I saw it on your syllabus, Paulo Freire. Yeah. I ultimately think there's a lot of problems in his analysis. But I think what you're saying is that when we're teaching a book or when we're discussing a really important issue in the mode of education, where you're trying to actually learn what somebody is saying before you enter into rage or critique. Right. So what's happened on so many college campuses with any political movement of the left or the right, or any political candidate of the left or the right, it's almost like you can't ask, what does so-and-so stand for? Or what does this movement seek to achieve? Simply asking, what does this movement seek to achieve? Or what kind of like that's like an informational question. It's not even a judgment question. But actually just asking questions can be considered not getting on with the program and not endorsing something. So we either have to kind of pick the most outrageous quote we can from somebody we disagree with in order to discredit them, or we have to affirm this term or this word or this movement without even having a question to ask what it is, and maybe pose the question, is there an alternative way? Because I've always felt, as a woman who identifies more conservative and as a person of faith, I care deeply about social justice. My work has been on immigration from Haiti and Mexico and people with mental illness and drug abuse. And so I often want to ask, is there another approach from the progressive approach? But the answer I often get is kind of like, if you're not with the progressive program, then you're part of the problem. And I have found that to be a very difficult environment to have an open debate about, hey, look, you can care about poverty and not necessarily think that XYZ program is the best way to reduce poverty, but it doesn't mean that you hate poor people, that you don't support a particular program. So that's what I read that you were trying to argue, is that we're not even really having open conversation, understanding of facts, looking at different sides. But then the question becomes, what does that do to friendships among students? What kind of friendships are you forming if that's your mode of learning?
Well, so much there in what you just said. On the question of friendships, I think it harms it tremendously. And this is something I've thought about a lot. And I'm sure everyone listening to this interview has probably thought about it a lot too. I'm old enough that when I went to college, we didn't have computers. We had a computer lab. We would go and type our papers at the computer lab. Nobody had phones. They didn't exist. And so obviously there was no texting and there was no social media. Well, what that meant is you knew a lot less about a lot of things than you do now. My best friends from Oberlin right now are very far from me, as a pretty conservative woman, as I can imagine. They're very, very far. They're very far left. They hold views on things that I don't agree with. I hold views that they don't agree with. But the beauty of the world, and we're not going back to this, I know, the beauty of the world prior to social media and technology as it is now is that we didn't know all that stuff, and we could have broader friendships with a broader array of people that I think it's easy to do now. Because imagine you become friends on Facebook with somebody, and then they post something outrageous and you think, oh, that's the kind of person, I know people like that. I know what she thinks already. I don't need to know anymore. And it's a hindrance to friendship rather than an encouragement of friendship. So in many ways, I think we are in a worse position for forming friendships because we are constantly encouraged and encouraging others to, post this inflammatory article or tweet or whatever it is, and it kind of closes off the possibility of friendships with people who are quite different from you, and that makes me sad. So Margarita, that's a response to that question. Mm-hmm. Let me say real briefly, though, one other thing. I mean, you're talking about there being potentially different ways of approaching political and social problems, but that one side wants to make it such that you can't ask questions about that. That to me is why this whole notion of disinterest, or whatever I may end up calling it in the future, is so important, because you can't, this is the sacredness of the university classroom at its best. You're talking about something, you can ask those questions. It doesn't necessarily mean you hold those views. I always tell my students, look, in a seminar, I don't necessarily think what you say is what you always believe. But in engaging an author seriously and in trying to understand what that author was saying, you can postulate things, and you can ask questions, and you can say things that you might not say out of the classroom. And I think that's something only a university can provide, because everywhere else there are consequences, certainly on social media, but even in friendships. You've got to be careful what you say and take others' views into account. And in a university, you're a little bit freer on that score.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to move into the Q&A from the audience. So I should have said this in the beginning, but Professor Corey has agreed to stay online until 1/2 past the hour. So we're going to go over the hour. So there's still time. I know some of you may have to check out, but please make sure, if you have to check out early, please come back to Scala's YouTube channel. We will post this video for you to see the Q&A. And I want to just encourage people to send in their questions, whether it's about campus activism, love, leisure. Go to the Q&A button and submit some questions. I have one that's kind of going to get us going, and then there are others coming in, I can see. But I wanted to ask you kind of, again, just to bring this down to the concrete. You teach and I teach. So what does this actually look like in the classroom? How can we actually have classrooms? Again, this could be at the high school level, it could be at the college level. How do we actually have difficult conversations when we live in a time where most people agree not only did we not have computers in our bedrooms, Elizabeth, I really feel we are more polarized as a society. And so how do you actually create an environment where these dialogues happen across differences? And is there a difference between debating somebody and having a conversation?
Great question. That's something I think about often. And I think a lot of it has to do with the answer will change according to the subject matter. So for example, I teach a class called Great Texts and Art. And it's basically an art history and great books class. We read a wonderful book called The Story of Art by E.H. Gombrich, which I would recommend to everybody. And we look at art across the ages. It's a 2-semester course. We do a lot of talking in there about why did an artist convey this in this way? What what has changed between these time periods and so on and so forth. But in there, it's a little bit easier to say there's actually a sort of a body of knowledge that you need to know, and I'm going to tell you some of it. Nobody likes lecturers anymore. That's the new thing. You flip the classroom. But in a situation like art history, there's actually kind of a body of knowledge that you need to convey to students. Well, then imagine, though, a different kind of classroom. I'm going on my own experience here. I teach in a constitutional law class, an introduction to constitutional law. And the aim of that class is to introduce students, of course, to the major landmark cases in American legal history. And it is important that they get information there too. And so we read the cases themselves and the dissents and the concurrences. But there it's different, because what we do is talk about contentious issues. So we'll look at affirmative action and racism, or we'll look at abortion law, or we'll look at presidential power, or any number of other things. And in that kind of situation, it's very, you have to lay down ground rules. You have to say, look, we're going to be talking about things that you already have an opinion about, probably, and you already care about. How can we do this in such a way that we are not going to take offense at the view that is raised by somebody that you disagree with? And so what I do is to say basically what I just said a few minutes ago. Yeah, well, it's not necessarily the case that you're going to believe everything you say here, but let's try to get at what these authors are trying to convey in the way they're trying to convey it. I mean, you can do this with any kind of serious text. What did the author mean to say? Let's understand that first before we go on and criticize from the basis of our own limited experience. So part of it is laying down some ground rules that you will respect the views of others, and people do this. Once the rules are in place, somehow the conversation tends to go really well for the most part. But it also, as I said, it depends on the subject matter. And so in some classes, you'll have a lot of debate and a lot of disagreement. In other classes, it's very much more conversational.
Well, along those lines, I've also laid down some ground rules like that. Another question I have for you, how do you put this into practice? You say in your articles that a lot of discussion also revolves around students' identity, and often around a particular race, class, and sex, or sexual identification. Yeah. How do you deal with students in class who want to make discussion revolve around their identity or their experience? How do you do what you say we should do in education, which is acknowledge the importance of our identity, while also broadening what that identity could be about, and also not essentializing one aspect of our identity? Yeah. Essentially, how do you deal with identity politics as it plays out in the classroom while maintaining what's good about integrating one's identity with learning?
That's a great question. And to be perfectly honest with you, at Baylor, the identity politics piece is not super emphasized. I mean, in other words, the students I get are usually pretty open to learning. They don't come in with a political axe to grind, either conservative or liberal. It used to be that most students at Baylor were more conservative. That's actually changing. It's pretty mixed. So we have a good variety. So what I'm saying is, in general, I don't have a lot of experience of dealing with probably what Oberlin students would be like in the present day. I don't have a lot of experience with that. To the extent, people are inclined to say, well, as a woman, the famous as a somebody, which is a kind of cutting off of conversation. I find that great texts are the best way of dealing with that. And I'll use an example from the Aeneid. And sometimes we will read in that class the love affair of Dido and Aeneas. And oftentimes, and that's where Dido kills herself because Aeneas leaves her, and it's very tragic. Sometimes the young men in the class will say, well, I was much more like Dido in my last relationship. Or the women will say, well, I was kind of like Aeneas. And what I like about that is that they are being encouraged to identify not so much with their race or their sex or their class, but rather with the human experiences that are going on in the books. And that can happen. I mean, that can happen across the great books. So I find that's a one way of dealing with just because I'm a woman, everything has to look this particular way. They encourage you not to take those kind of perspectives.
That's a great argument for reading the classics. I have to say I smirked when I read one of your articles, because right now in Scala's alumni summer reading group were reading Plato's Symposium, in particular to learn more about different ways of understanding love. But you know, when I first picked this up, I'm not really trained in the classics, and I pick it up and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't, am I going to get through this? I need a group to get through this. But once I got into it, I thought, okay, this is great. This is totally out of my time period. It's totally out of my wheelhouse. And it allows me to explore my identity and my understanding of something like love in a context totally different than mine, which in some ways then depoliticizes the question of identity, because then we're not trying to discover our identity with reference to some currently salient political question. Not that those aren't important, but that's not the only way. So I guess what I'm at, so that's a great argument for the classics, but I also think we need teachers. We need teachers who can help us see that the classics like Plato and Augustine can actually help us get to those questions, right? Because precisely because the classics take us out of our current time period. So one of the concerns I have with the activist model of education, if the end of education is to change our current system, then there's almost no reason to study the past, to study the tradition. So what the activist mode ends up doing, and you've said this, it tends to really start to, sometimes slowly and sometimes aggressively, get rid of tradition. And then in the activist mode, there's really nothing other than the present. It's not even clear to me what the activist mode has as the future. It's just kind of a mantra of change, but change to what end? Like there's no concept of history, there's no concept of time, there's no concept of legacy. It's all about just kind of breaking things down into this fragmentary, kind of momentary thing. And I'm not sure that that vision of the university or of education at any level is going to work, because the human person needs to have a concept of identity that transcends past, present, and future. So now, speaking of our present system, I mean, one question from the audience is really about, is this model of disinterested education that you believe in, is it possible in our current system? And again, the question is really whether or not the disinterested model can work in a capitalist society, which is oriented towards self-interest. So I guess I wanted to ask, I'm sure you've thought about that question, I'm sure you've heard it before, and I wondered, how would you answer that question?
I think it is possible. I think it's really rare, though, to have it happen, because for one reason, I mean, we are relentlessly practical people. Whether we're capitalists or socialists or whatever, we are constantly concerned about our lives and our future prospects and all these normal, you know, who am I going to marry? Where am I going to live? These kinds of normal and very human concerns. It's almost artificial to do what I'm asking in disinterested education. Artificial, but very valuable, because it requires us to set aside those very pressing human interests for a while. It doesn't require us to set them aside for all time, or to say that it doesn't matter what I do after college. That's never been my aim. But what I'm asking for in the disinterest is, could we read Plato, say, without thinking about, well, how will this affect contemporary politics? Could we simply read Plato and understand Plato in his own words and in his own time, and take some joy in doing that? Or Augustine. Now, granted, there will be personal implications, I think. I mean, for me, all these books I read, I'm constantly reflecting on them with respect to myself. And I think many students do. But I'm not going to them with the idea that, well, if I read Plato, then I'll be able to do X and Y. I go to them with, if I read Plato, then maybe I can understand Plato. I mean, this is the St. John's model, for whatever you may think of it, and I have mixed feelings about it. What goes on in those classrooms is nothing practical. And everybody comes out of St. John's, they do end up doing something afterwards, but there's this sort of interval of time where the practical questions are set aside for a moment. And that's, I think, what I'm arguing for. The problem with that in the contemporary university is that so few people now have any experience of it that they find it weird. It was like, why would you do something that seems to have no point? Why, this is useless. You know, why don't we just go and do things that are useful and that will make society better? And you have to make a very strong argument for the usefulness of useless knowledge, as another book title goes, for people to get it. And many people will never get it.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a quick comment that the way that Zoom works, the chat is for a quick back and forth between each other. The Q&A button is where I'm reading questions from. It's a question of the technology, how things come across presented. It's very difficult for me to follow questions in Q&A because they kind of disappear quickly. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A button. Thank you. So another question that has come in, and this really goes more to your own personal story. If you could comment a little bit, one listener wants to know about how your Christian faith is related to your love for the liberal arts, and in particular with questions about the love of God and beauty and art. And is there some kind of intrinsic link between faith and love and beauty and art? Or do you think that only people of faith have this interest in beauty?
I do not think that only people of faith have this interest, are the only people who have this interest in beauty, for sure. That is not true. I do think that some of, these are really huge questions and really good, but I guess I'll touch on only a small part. I do think this notion of achievement and worry about making a mark in the world is particularly addressed by the Christian faith. In other words, I think if you are not a believer, or not necessarily, I mean, if you're not a Christian and you're not looking for a kind of transcendence that comes through Christ, it's hard to understand how achievement is as unimportant as I'm saying it is. I mean, for me, achievement is good insofar as it's a part of human life, but I understand there to be greater purposes to life than personal achievement. And Christianity says the very same thing. Obviously, that's sort of the point. It's not about you, and it's not about what you do on your own, but it's rather your submission to a God who cares about you and who hopes for your eternal salvation in a very different realm. So I think it's easier to downplay the achievement part if you have that faith.
Great. Thank you. That's great. Another question coming from Daryl DiMarzio, who teaches education and philosophy at University of Scranton and at Columbia Teachers College. And he's familiar with Oakeshott. And he asks about Oakeshott's essay, A Place of Learning, which is a rich discussion of human nature. And Oakeshott argues that the human being interprets himself or herself, in various modes. And you mentioned some of these: the economic, political, theological, biological, and therefore the human being can't be reduced to an interested mode. So he asks, is not a liberal or a disinterested approach to learning precisely the mode that actually does the most justice? Like bringing in this word justice, right? We care a lot about justice in education. So where I see this question leading is, isn't it a concern of justice to provide students the kind of education which does the most good for them as a human being? And if that's the case, then aren't the stakes really high when considering the crisis of the university for K-12? Is this question about the proper form of education itself not a question of justice?
I love that question, and I've never thought about it in those terms. But you're actually making the case that far from being disinterested, this is perhaps the most important mode of education, which is, in other words, to take into account the fullness of human experience, which is not just practical. It's not just biological, for sure. It's not just political, but that Oakeshott is identifying there are all sorts of modes in which we can understand human experience, and it is the job of a university to expose students to that. And what are we doing in so many cases now? Exposing them only to the very most practical utilitarian ways of viewing the world. So if I'm understanding you correctly, I think I completely agree with that it does most justice to the fullness of the human condition to take all these diverse modes into account, rather than just, making education, a sterile job training or political activism. Yeah. I mean, Oakeshott's great on this. He has, for those of you who are interested, he's got a book called The Voice of Liberal Learning that is beautifully written set of essays and is very radical in the present day. It is making the case for learning as an end in itself, and not subservient to practical considerations. The Voice of Liberal Learning is the name.
Great. Well, I now want to ask a question that's coming in from another former speaker at a Scala event, Erica Kidd. She's a professor at University of St. Thomas and gave a beautiful lecture on Augustine's book, The Confessions, which you can find on Scala's YouTube. And she's a busy professor. She's a woman with children. She's running a program. And she just says, and then I think this is relevant to anybody listening, but what are some practical tips to keep in touch with leisure when you're in a position of responsibility or administration as a busy person? Any habits or any routines? And if I can combine that with another question, I think in a very similar vein, from Kelly Lipinski, who graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary and helped me in the very beginnings of Scala, and she's now working at a church. And she's asking also for practical tips to break through this self-interested culture, which I think in a lot of churches is also very, very common. And people might be coming to church to learn something different, but what are some practical tips? What are some books, some things, some habits to cultivate that break through the kind of self-interested, achievement-oriented culture and keep what's good about that while also promoting habits and routines that foster leisure and love? Yet another very small question for you, Elizabeth.
That is intense, yes. Very, very, very big. In a way, I'm the wrong person to answer this, because I don't, as much as I intellectually recognize the dangers of practical life and the frustrations of practical life, I tend to be a person who gets caught up in the mundane because I just have so many responsibilities. So I can tell you things that I think are helpful. I can't say that I always do them. As a mother, I have 3 children, ages 15, 13, and 6. So I've got lots going on with them and lots going on in my own life. Practical tips, I would say get up early. Carve out a few minutes or hopefully an hour or some time to yourself in the morning before everything gets going. You can read devotional literature, you can read Pieper, you can read really anything you want to read during that time. But I find that if I don't do something early before everyone else is up, I lose my leisure. So the getting up early is a number one tip. You'll laugh at this. Maybe people will laugh at this. Something else I do, and it's jointly with my husband, who's also an academic and also very busy. We have cocktail hour together every evening. And we sit down and we make a drink and we talk. And that is vital for remembering what life is about. Because when you're working on the to-do list and you're going down, got to do this and this and this and this, and you never carve out time to relate to, especially a spouse, as another person, then that gets lost. It easily gets lost because there's so much else that's pressing. So I suppose, and also, of course, if you can, keep the Sabbath. I'm often not very good at doing this, but set aside a day that is simply not about your work and not about you, and is a day of celebration. Pieper's great on this because he talks about celebration as a very vital part of life that's not just fun, but actually essential to the soul, is important. So, I guess I'm not the best at keeping these things, but I would say carving out some time here and there to do the civilized, leisured things is the best I can offer.
Mm-hmm. I would just add to that from my own experience and also throw in an answer to a question here coming from Gabriel Brom, who says that he's Jewish and a lot of what we're saying resonates with his Jewish faith. And is there any kind of, and I would say, you just mentioned the Sabbath, right? Jewish people observe the Sabbath and in a very real way. Reading the Psalms, meditating on the Psalms has been incredibly powerful for me. It's a wonderful book. It's not just a meditation of kind of clearing the mind, but in actually meditating on the Word of God, which I think Christians get from the Jewish tradition. I'd also say that COVID, as weird as it was, forced me, and I think a lot of other people, to pick 1 or 2 or maybe 3 daily routines to keep sanity. And for me, those are habits that I should cultivate all the time and need to kind of always focus on. But it's similar to what you said, picking some time to quiet the mind. And for most busy people, that's going to be first thing in the morning, before the emails start coming in, before the kids, before all the responsibilities come in the door or the inbox or whatever. Are you taking some intentional time to quiet the mind? And when I do that, my day goes better. I often, because I have the opportunity to do that through going to daily mass. Well, during COVID, I couldn't do that. And it was challenging because I had to really focus on my own interior life more, and I found it hard. The other thing I did, similar to you, was set aside a particular time that was going to be my social hour during COVID, which, kind of was always there, but really committing to it because I needed that human interaction when everything else had shut down. And it made me realize how tempting it is to go through my day without that quiet time in the morning and without that social time being leisure time, because the social time can become another task. You're not really present to the person in front of you. And that is really just working on our internal disposition. So I think anybody as busy as they are can always work to improve their internal disposition. And this also, I think, leads into the other question Gabriel answered, or this is how I would answer, Gabriel asked, that I would venture an answer to as well. He really liked the vision of the personalized teaching you mentioned, where professors are talking to their students one-on-one and having them over. But he asks, referring to Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. If you haven't read that, I highly recommend it. You teach it in your summer program, I teach it in mine. Is this hard to have this personal relationship with students when certain groups are demonized, in particular conservatives on campuses, and when students often are just very psychologically weak, I would say? He says, snowflakes, that's a word that's often been used to describe this kind of fragile psychological state. And they're psychologically weak, but also ready to make these accusations. So how do these personal friendships between faculty and students happen in this context where these relationships are often weaponized, is his question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's also become infinitely harder to navigate these questions, to my mind, in the last 10 years or so. Because while Title IX has done some good things, it's also made it such that personal relationships are, from the get-go, looked on at as potential sources of danger, which they are and always have been. But the loss in not being able to have those kinds of relationships, especially between professors and students, is great. The loss is great, I think. There are ways of doing it that are beneficial both to the student and also protect the teacher. I mean, maybe I'm going straight to the legal part of this when that's not what you were asking, but it's real in this day and age. I mean, we're told we can't close our doors, and I don't. Well, actually, I do sometimes. When I'm talking to somebody about something personal, I will close my door, but my door has a window so you can see in. But it's especially an issue for male teachers, because it's assumed that they are potentially a predator, whether that's fair or not, because some definitely are, and that's very bad. All this is to say, it's really hard to cultivate the kind of intense personal friendships that I had 30 years ago with some of my mentors. Ways of doing it, just sort of asking for practical tips again, are, have students over with your family. Go to church with your students, do things at the Starbucks on campus. But all I'm saying is that getting out of the classroom or the teacher's office, or, these sort of official spaces that make us see each other only as teacher and student, is very beneficial. And there are ways of making it work. And I would also say that I don't think many students, well, this is Baylor, so I'm speaking from one university. Our students are not snowflakes. Somebody can always take offense at something, and there are situations where, inappropriate things happen. But in general, the students are pretty strong, and they're able to take criticism. So I still think it is possible to have these relationships. You just have to be very careful and protect yourself in ways that you probably didn't have to 25 years ago.
I agree with all of what you said. In fact, I would love to be invited to a Jewish Seder dinner with students on campus or faculty, or these kind of group events, right? The kind of friendships and intimacy you're talking about don't only have to happen one-on-one.
No.
So and in fact, sometimes it's easier for me as a practical matter to get a group of students together and share a lunch. For example, you can share a lunch in the dining hall.
Yes.
Most universities make it pretty easy for faculty to eat in the dining hall, and you can eat with one student, you can eat with two or three. That's another kind of really easy way. But I have found that in small groups, under 5, let's say, the conversation really can be personal. In a classroom setting, and perhaps is when students might start to become a little bit more political in the classroom. But in smaller groups, that's actually rarely the case, I have found. But
Marguerite,
now, mhm,
can I add one more thing to that?
sure.
One other thing I would say is that students are dying for adults, not their parents, to talk to them about important things that have to do with mostly love, potential marriage, and what is life like after you leave college? What is life like as an adult? I mean, what does a flourishing adult life look like? So to the Baylor Honors College's credit, we had some seminars. We had one on love, marriage, and dating last semester. And we had 2 married people, I was one of them, and then a younger graduate student who talked very frankly to students about, okay, what does dating look like? What should it look like? Where is it going wrong? How can we make it better? What does marriage look like? Does marriage make you happy? I mean, all these basic questions, but they want to know about them, and they want to know about them not just from their own parents, but from other adults in their lives. So I think to the extent that we can do that is great.
I've seen Anna Moreland, who also spoke here at the conference on friendship, love, and happiness, spoke about her class on adulting at Villanova. That's what I call it. I'm sure it has a more formal name. But, it is interesting to look at college orientation programs. There's some stuff on picking your classes, and there's a lot of stuff aimed at liabilities, like how not to get too drunk and how not to commit sexual harassment. Well, what if there were orientation programs that raise these questions? What does authentic friendship look like? What is marriage? What's a good marriage? What is love? I think it would be a great thing to create these spaces for students to ask these questions, because they're dying to hear and to have a space to think about it. Now, just to start to wrap down, we've got a couple more questions. I want to ask one about achievement, and then get back to the final questions about friendships and diversity. Getting back to what you said earlier about achievement, Sarah Bixler, who's a PhD student here at Princeton Theological Seminary, she's asking about the achievement model of education, in particular for students who might come from disadvantaged backgrounds of one kind or another. And there's so much at stake in their achievement of a university achievement. Of achieving a university education. So in the kind of critique of the achievement model, does that look different for students for whom achievement might really actually be more important socioeconomically?
Yeah. Here's where I do think those two ends can coexist. I mean, obviously, in my argument against achievement, I'm not saying that the students shouldn't do anything after college, or they shouldn't try to have really great careers. I hope they do. What I am arguing is that could coexist with an intensive liberal arts, conversational kind of disinterested education. I mean, there can be both that go on. I think what the danger is, especially it's not so much often the students as the students' parents. My husband and I do orientation talks often for Baylor, and very often parents will say, well, I'm worried that any time that's spent in this uselessness, so-called uselessness, is going to harm my son or daughter, when that son or daughter could be doing another biology class or another business class. Why would he take the time out to read these books that seem to have nothing to do with his or her future life? And so what we say in response is that, well, life is not, it's again a point I've been making throughout this interview. It's not all about career. The questions that come up in these books are like, what is love? What is a worthwhile life? How should I approach death? Is there life after death? These questions that everybody has asked him or herself at some point. So to say again that those questions are not important is not, to pick up this word that was just used, is not to do justice to the full humanity of the students. But I do think there is room in college for the student to have some experience of this useless liberal learning, even as he or she's certainly going to go on to a career.
Mm-hmm. All right, now for just two quick questions, and then we're gonna wind down. All right, so we have here a question from Kelsey Collister, and she works at a nonprofit, and the term diversity is really popular right now. And she wants to know kind of, what do you think about whether or not we can change the dialogue so that truth is elevated rather than social justice becoming a religion in and of itself? And I would say kind of within that, justice we talked a little bit about, but diversity for many people has become the end of education. And you've written a little bit about this question of diversity in education. So how can that be perhaps reframed?
Well, I think the problem with the use of diversity right now is that it ascribes too much of a person's identity to characteristics that are in essence only part of that identity. So to the degree that people assume, I mean, Margarita, this probably happens to you, people assume a lot about me because I'm a woman in academia. So they think, oh, you're a woman, so you must be pretty liberal. And they're surprised to find out when I say, oh, actually, I'm pretty conservative. That's an assumption people make about me based on my membership in a group. And what I would say back to that is to say, yeah, well, I'm a woman. And so there are certain things that come with that. There's certain things that come with different racial identifications, certainly things that comes with different sexual orientations and so on. But it is up to the individual person to decide in what way those different parts of that identity play out. And people are perfectly free to be different from what is expected of them in terms of those characteristics. So I guess I kind of think we need to make a distinction between, when we're talking about groups, you could say things about groups, but then to generalize on the basis of, oh, well, so-and-so is a part of X group, therefore he or she must think this, is really doing a disservice to that person's individual ability to think for himself, or to express views that are his or hers, but not necessarily to be predicted by membership in a group.
Right.
For that matter, I think we need intellectual diversity. I mean, people love to say, well, we need intellectual diversity, but I think we do. Certainly a wider diversity of political and religious viewpoints would be a good thing on campus.
Yeah. Well, I would agree with that. And I'll just end by responding in my own to a question from Bess Blackburn, who went on the Scala trip last year and helps out with some of the Scala social media. And she's asking about how to cultivate friendships centered on the life of the mind and not based in identity politics or shallow things like the social media makes friendship to be. And so to build off of what you just said, in the best classes I've taught at Princeton and North Carolina, Yale, and all my groups in Scala, it's amazing the diversity that comes out when you really get to know who people are. And certainly our socioeconomic background, the color of our skin, whether we're male or female, certainly tell us something important. But it doesn't really tell you about the diversity you have in the classroom, because you have diversity in terms of, as you said in your articles, what are people's loves? People have different inclinations. People have different talents. People have quirky personalities, I've learned when I take them on these trips and you incorporate some sharing or some game playing. You also have people who have different kinds of physical disabilities or particular, as I just mentioned, particular gifts. So I think part of what happens with identity politics or social media is that we're almost like given a deck of cards that we have to pick an identity from. And that identity has to fit one of these groups that fits this narrative of going from oppression towards freedom. That's the most common question I get. Like, as a Catholic woman, do I feel oppressed by the male bishops? And the answer is no, I don't. And there's this complex, I could go on about that, but in general, no, I don't feel oppressed that the leaders of my church are men. I have found the men in leadership to be interested in what I have to say and to be listening and respectful, and that's what I care about. So again, these cards, I like the idea of a deck of cards because you have to pick from one of them and it kind of flattens you. Like there's no depth and there's no complexity. And so what I have found that kind of what students are really eager for is to get beyond the typical way we think about diversity and actually get to know who people are. So I do polls at the start of class and I ask people like, how frequently do you attend religious services? Have you changed your religion? You could ask people like, get people to talk about their upbringing, their parents, their family values, how they spent their time with families, all kinds of things. that come into diversity beyond what's kind of currently politically salient. Again, without denying that in certain instances, the color of your skin or being a woman tells us something really important, but it just doesn't tell us everything about someone's personality. So that's what I would say in response to the question from Beth on identity politics. But if you have any other final thoughts, I'll give you the final word on what does it take to actually cultivate friendships in the life of the mind beyond identity politics. Any final thoughts on that, Elizabeth?
Well, it's a great question, and books could be written about it. But the one thing I would say is that it requires a willingness to try to throw yourself, I mean, this sounds like John Stuart Mill, but to try to throw yourself into the mind and heart of somebody who is not you. And that's hard. Sometimes that's easy, when you have a lot in common. But let me tell you, sometimes it is the hardest thing in the world to say, I need to see the world through this person's eyes who I don't even agree with, or maybe you don't even like. But just to try to understand the world as he or she sees it is the best thing, I think, for cultivating friendships. Because then when even if somebody you think, I really don't like this person, you can find out things you do like about him or her. And so I think basically a fundamental attitude of both humility about your own views and charity toward others is the best foundation for friendship.
Great, which brings us back to the importance of leisure and slowing down the mind and the interior life to be able to enter into those conversations in a way that you're truly having a dialogue, coming to know the other person as they are and as they see themselves and why they believe what they believe, and not always entering in a stance of debate or taking down, which I think is really wearing students' friendships on college campuses right now. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful dialogue. It's been a pleasure to have you. I will say I have been incredibly impressed with the students who come to Scala from the Baylor Honors College. So if any parent is listening today, please do consider it. With regards to parents who are concerned about their students' achievement, I would say your students' long-term achievement depends on the quality of their college education, not simply what they major in. And I think also, as you say in some of your articles, look, not everybody has to have a 4-year degree in classics. The idea of a liberal arts education is simply that there's a place for leisure and there's a place for disinterested learning. Whether that's 90% of your curriculum or 25%, the point is it shouldn't be 0%. So I'm a fan of these gap years students are taking. And again, it could be 1 year, it could be 2 years, but some aspect of education has to be preserved for this liberal learning. And if we don't do that, I think we're not doing justice to the person, as Daryl pointed out. And ultimately, we're not actually promoting diversity because we're putting people into pre-filtered identity categories or pre-filtered occupations. And that's not the end of education. So I once again want to thank Baylor's Institute for Study of Religion for co-sponsoring this and the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. And I want to encourage people, if you aren't already, to connect with Scala, because Scala wants to bring together educators at all levels, lifelong learners, people who are maybe encountering these ideas for the first time. And we hope to really build a movement of people who are concerned about liberal education and want to share these ideas. So we will have one more webinar for now, one more next week with Bill Damon of Stanford at the same time, 3 p.m. EST on Monday. And please do, come to that. Go to our YouTube channel, sign up for Scala's newsletter, and please do share these ideas. If you feel so moved, please do donate to Scala. It's a nonprofit, and we can only do these activities through the generous support of many benefactors. I really hope that this webinar has helped transform how you think about education, because Scala really wants to promote this idea of a liberal arts education and show how it works in different contexts. As I said at the start, Scala wants to help people become like their favorite teachers. And long before I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Corey in person, I read her articles and I knew I wanted to be a teacher like her. So you've been an inspiration to me ever since I read your work, and meeting you and now dialoguing with you has helped me enormously. So I really hope that this webinar helps create a flourishing community of educators and students who share exemplary educational practices to further human freedom in all forms of knowledge and ultimately transform lives. And it's only by transforming lives that we're going to build the kind of societies that we all want to live in. So thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you, Professor Corey.
Thank you.